Episode 7: Bacteria Rule the World. Look around you. What do you see? Trees, perhaps, or buildings. Maybe you see animals, birds in the sky, insects on the ground. If you are inside, you see the products of human civilization, furniture and walls, and the device on which you are hearing these words. Everywhere you look, you see the visible world, the world of large things you can see with your naked eye. But this visible world is not the whole world. It is not even most of the world. Beneath and behind and within everything you see, there is another world, invisible to your eyes, but vast beyond measure. This is the microbial world, the world of bacteria and archaea, single-celled organisms too small to see without a microscope, but so numerous that they outnumber all the visible organisms on Earth by factors of millions or billions. There are more bacterial cells in your body right now than there are human cells. Your skin is covered with them. Your digestive system teems with them. They are in your mouth, on your hands, in the air you breathe. Most of them are harmless. Many are beneficial. Some are essential for your survival. And this has always been true. Since life began on Earth, 3.8 billion years ago or more, bacteria and their cousins, the archaea, have dominated our planet. For the first 2 billion years of life's history, they were the only life. Even after more complex organisms evolved, bacteria remained and remain the most numerous, the most diverse, the most adaptable forms of life on Earth. This is their story, the story of the invisible empire that shaped our planet, that created the atmosphere we breathe, that transformed barren rock into living soil, that made Earth habitable for every organism that came after. This is the story of how bacteria ruled the world, and in many ways still do. Where we left off in the last episode, life had just originated, perhaps 3.8 billion years ago, perhaps earlier. The first organisms were simple, single-celled, lacking any internal compartments or complex structures. These organisms, the ancestors of all life, were prokaryotes, a term that means before nucleus, referring to the fact that they have no nucleus to contain their genetic material. Today, prokaryotes are divided into great domains, bacteria and archaea. These two groups are as different from each other as either is from complex organisms, like plants and animals. They diverged very early in life's history, probably within a few hundred million years, of the origin of life itself, and they have been evolving separately ever since. Bacteria and archaea look similar under a microscope. Both are small, typically a few micrometers in size. which is a few millionths of a meter. Both are single cells with no nucleus, with their DNA floating freely in the cytoplasm. Both have cell membranes and usually cell walls that provide structure and protection. But on a molecular level, bacteria and archaea are profoundly different. Their cell membranes are made of different types of lipids. Their cell walls are constructed from different materials. The machinery they use to read their DNA and build proteins is different. Even the chemical details of their metabolism often differ. Why did life split into two separate lineages so early? We do not know. Perhaps it was simply a matter of different populations of early cells adapting to the different environments, and over time accumulating so many differences that they could no longer exchange genes or interbreed. Or perhaps there was some major environmental change that created different selective pressures, favoring different solutions to the problem of staying alive. Whatever the cause, with 3.5 billion years ago, both bacteria and archaea were established and diversifying, and they were already doing something remarkable. They were changing the planet. The early Earth, as we have discussed in previous episodes, was a very different world from the one we know today. The ocean was warm, perhaps even hot in some places. The atmosphere was thick with carbon dioxide, with no free oxygen. The sky was orange or brown. The land was barren rock with no soil, no plants, nothing living on the surface. But in the ocean, life was flourishing. Bacterial and archaeal cells floated in the water, clung to rocks, formed mats on the seafloor. They were everywhere, multiplying, evolving, diversifying. These early microorganisms had to make a living somehow. They needed energy to power their cellular processes. They needed raw materials to build new cells. Different lineages evolved different strategies for obtaining these necessities. And these different strategies, these different metabolisms would have profound effects on the planet. Some early bacteria and archaea were chemotrophs, organisms that derive energy from chemical reactions. They might oxidize hydrogen or iron or sulfur, combining these elements with other molecules to release energy. This kind of metabolism is still common today, especially in environments where light is scarce, such as deep sea hydrothermal vents or deep underground. Chemotherapy is probably the most ancient form of metabolism. The way the very first life powered itself. It makes sense. The early ocean, especially near hydrothermal vents, was rich in introduced chemicals, molecules that could be oxidized to release energy. And chemotherapy does not require any complex apparatus, just the right enzymes to catalyze the reactions. But chemotherapy has a limitation. It depends on a supply of reduced chemicals, and while the early Earth has had such chemicals in abundance, they were not unlimited. An organism that relied entirely on chemotherapy would be constrained by the availability of its chemical fuel. Some bacteria evolved a different strategy, one that would change Earth forever. They evolved the ability to use light as an energy source. They became photosynthetic. Photosynthesis is one of the most important inventions in the history of life. It is the process by which organisms capture energy from sunlight and use it to convert carbon dioxide and water into organic molecules and oxygen. Every plant, every algae, every photosynthetic bacterium uses some form of this process. But photosynthesis did not appear fully formed. It evolved in stages, with simpler form appearing first. The earliest form of photosynthesis, which probably evolved within a few 100 million years of the origin of life, didn't produce oxygen. Instead, these early photosynthetic bacteria used light to drive the oxidation of molecules like hydrogen sulfide or iron, producing sulfur or iron oxides as waste products instead of oxygen. This kind of photosynthesis still exists today in certain bacteria that live in sulfur-rich environments. It is simpler than oxygenic photosynthesis, requiring only one photosystem to work instead of two, and it was probably adequate for early bacteria living in an ocean rich in reduced sulfur and iron. But then, sometime around 3 billion years ago, perhaps earlier, a group of bacteria evolved a more sophisticated form of photosynthesis. These bacteria, which we now call cyanobacteria, developed a two-stage photosynthetic system that could split water molecules using the hydrogen to build organic molecules and releasing the oxygen as a waste product. This was revolutionary. Water is abundant, unlike hydrogen sulfide or reduced iron, which are limited and localized. Water is everywhere in the ocean. A bacterium that could use water as a source of hydrogen had access to an essentially unlimited supply of raw material. Cyanobacteria could live anywhere there was light and water, which meant almost anywhere in the ocean. And they did. Cyanobacteria spread across the ancient ocean, forming vast mats and stromatolites, layered structures built up by successive generations of bacterial growth. These stromatolites are among the oldest fossils we have, preserved in rocks dating back 3.5 billion years or more. You can see modern stromatolites in a few places on Earth today, such as Shark Bay in Australia, where hypersaline conditions prevent animals from grazing on the bacterial mats. These modern stromatolites are likely very similar to those that covered much of the ancient ocean floor, built by countless generations of cyanobacteria growing, photosynthesizing, and dying. But the cyanobacteria did more than just spread and multiply. They changed the chemistry of the ocean and eventually the atmosphere. Every time a cyanobacterium split a water molecule to power photosynthesis, it released oxygen. At first, this oxygen didn't accumulate. The ocean was full of reduced substances, iron and sulfur and organic molecules that reacted with oxygen as soon as it was produced. The oxygen was consumed faster than it could accumulate, bound up in oxidized materials and precipitated out of solution. This is why the ocean floor from this period is often marked by banded iron formations, layers of iron oxide alternating with layers of silica. These formations, some of the largest iron ore deposits on Earth, are the rust of the ancient ocean, the products of oxygen produced by cyanobacteria reacting with dissolved iron and precipitating to the seafloor. For hundreds of millions of years, this continued. Cyanobacteria produced oxygen. The oxygen reacted with iron and the other reduced substances. The ocean slowly oxidized, becoming less chemically reduced. But the atmosphere remained oxygen-free. Then, around 2.4 billion years ago, something changed. The reduced substances in the ocean, which had been soaking up oxygen for hundreds of millions of years, were finally exhausted. The ocean became saturated with oxygen, and the oxygen began to escape in the atmosphere. This event, which we'll discuss in detail in the next episode, is called the Great Oxidation Event, and it was one of the most important transitions in the Earth's history. But for now, let us focus on the organisms that caused it, the cyanobacteria, and on the world they inhabited before oxygen transformed the atmosphere. The Archean Eon, the period from 4 billion to 2.5 billion years ago, was the age of bacteria and archaea. For a billion and a half years, these simple organisms were the only life on Earth. They dominated every environment where life could exist. The sunlit surface waters, the deep ocean, the seafloor, the sediments, even kilometers deep in the crust. And they were diverse. Modern bacteria and archaea occupy an astonishing range of environments, from the boiling waters of hot springs to the frozen soils of Antarctica, from the acidic drainage of mines to the alkaline soda lakes, from the rich oxygen surface to the oxygen-free depths. And genetic studies suggest that diversity is ancient, that many of the major lineages of bacteria and archaea had already diverged by the Archean. Different lineages evolved different ways of making a living, different metabolisms adapted to different environments. Some were photosynthetic, like the cyanobacteria. Others were chemosynthetic, deriving energy from the chemical reactions. Some were aerobic, using oxygen if it was available, though in the early Archean there was no free oxygen. Others were anaerobic, living in the environments without oxygen, as most of the Earth was at that time. Some bacteria evolved the ability to fix nitrogen, converting nitrogen gas from the atmosphere into ammonia, which could then be used to build amino acids and other nitrogen-containing molecules. This was crucial because nitrogen is an essential element for life, but nitrogen gas is very unreactive and cannot be used directly by most organisms. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria made nitrogen available to the entire ecosystem. Other bacteria evolved the ability to produce methane as a byproduct of their metabolism. These methanogens, which are actually archaea, not bacteria, live in oxygen-free environments and produce methane by reducing carbon dioxide with hydrogen. In the Archean, when there was no oxygen to oxidize methane, these organisms may have produced enough methane to create a significant greenhouse effect, helping to keep Earth warm despite the sun being dimmer than it is today. This highlights an important point about early life. Bacteria and archaea were not just passive inhabitants of the Earth. They actively shaped the environment, changing the chemistry of the ocean and atmosphere, recycling elements, creating conditions that allowed life to persist and evolve. This is the Gaia hypothesis, proposed by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis. It suggests that the life doesn't just adapt to the environment, but actively modifies the environment to make it more hospitable. The Gaia hypothesis is controversial in some of its formulations, but the basic idea that the life and the environment co-evolve, that they influence each other in complex feedback loops, is widely accepted. In the Archean, this co-evolution was already occurring. Cyanobacteria were producing oxygen, changing the chemistry of the ocean. Methanogens were producing methane, affecting the climate. Nitrogen fixers were making nitrogen available, supporting the growth of other organisms. The invisible empire of bacteria and the archaea was reshaping the planet. But life in the Archean was also constrained. There was no oxygen in the atmosphere, which meant no ozone layer, which meant that the surface of the ocean was bathed in ultraviolet radiation that would be lethal to most modern organisms. Any organism living near the surface had to cope with this radiation, either by developing protective pigments like the carotenoids that give some modern bacteria their red and orange color, or by repairing the damage to DNA caused by UV exposure. There was also no complex multicellular life. All organisms were single cells. Some of them formed colonies or mats, like the stromatolites, but these were just aggregations of individual cells, not true multicellular organisms that specialized tissues and organs. Why did it take so long for the complex life to evolve? Why did bacteria and archaea remain single-celled for billions of years? Part of the answer is probably that there was no selective pressure for complexity. In the Archean ocean, nutrients were abundant, competition was low, and environments were stable. A single-celled organism could thrive without needing to become larger or more complex. Another part of the answer is energy. Complex life requires a lot of energy, and the metabolisms available to bacteria and archaea, while efficient for their purposes, may not have been capable of supporting the energy demands of larger, more complex cells. This would change with the evolution of eukaryotes, cells with mitochondria that could produce far more energy per cell. But the development was still billions of years in the future. For now, in the Archean, life was simple, but simple doesn't mean unsuccessful. Bacteria and archaea were and are incredibly successful organisms. They reproduce rapidly, often doubling in population every few hours. They can adapt to new environments quickly, evolving resistance to toxins or the ability to metabolize new substances in just a few generations. They can survive conditions that would kill any complex organism, from extreme heat to extreme cold to extreme acidity. And they are everywhere. There are more bacterial cells on Earth today that there are stars in the observable universe. They outnumber all other organisms combined. They live in every environment, from the deepest ocean trenches to the highest mountain peaks, from the driest deserts to the wettest rainforests, inside animals and plants, in the soil, in the air, in the rocks miles beneath the surface. This success is not an accident. It is the result of billions of years of evolution, of adaptation to every conceivable environment, of the invention of countless metabolic pathways and survival strategies. Bacteria and archaea are not primitive or inferior. They are exquisitely adapted, highly evolved, and they have been perfecting their craft for far longer than any complex organism has existed. In the Archean, these organisms laid the foundation for everything that would come after. They transformed the ocean from a sterile, chemical soup into a living ecosystem. They began the process of oxygenating the atmosphere, a process that would eventually make complex life possible. They invented photosynthesis, nitrogen fixation, and countless other biochemical processes that the rest of the life would later adopt. They also began to form more complex associations. Some bacteria formed symbiotic relationships with other bacteria living inside them, exchanging nutrients and services. This kind of symbiosis would eventually lead to one of the most important events in the history of life, the origin of eukaryotic cells, but that is a story for a later episode. For now, in the Archean, bacteria and archaea ruled alone. They were the entirety of the biosphere, the sum total of life on Earth, and they were transforming the planet slowly, invisibly, but inexorably. As we close this episode, take a moment to appreciate the microbial world. It is easy to overlook bacteria and archaea, to think of them as germs or as simple primitive organisms, but they are neither. They are the foundation of life on Earth, the organisms that make the planet habitable, that recycle nutrients, that produce oxygen, that support every ecosystem. Without bacteria, there would be no plants, because plants depend on nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil. Without bacteria, there would be no animals, because animals depend on bacteria in their guts to digest food. Without bacteria, there would be no decomposition, no recycling of organic matter, and the world would be buried in dead organisms and their waste. We live in a bacterial world. We always have. And even as complex life evolved and diversified, even as animals and plants came to dominate the visible world, the invisible empire of bacteria and archaea continued to thrive, continued to shape the planet, continued to be essential. In the next episode, we'll see what happened when the oxygen produced by cyanobacteria finally began to accumulate in the atmosphere. We will witness the great oxidation event, a transformation so profound that it changed the chemistry of the planet and created conditions for an entirely new kind of life. We will see how a waste product, oxygen, which was toxic to most organisms at the time, became the foundation of the modern biosphere. But for now, we celebrate the Archean, the age bacteria, the 2 billion years when single-celled organisms ruled the Earth and built the world we inhabit today. They were small, invisible, and seemingly simple, but they were mighty, and their legacy endures in every breath we take, in every organism in our bodies, in the very air we breathe. The invisible empire still reigns. It always has, and it always will. And my dear listener, if you are listening this, that means you're alive until the end. If you like the content that I'm doing, you can motivate me by a like and subscribe to by liking the video and subscribe to my channel. This will motivate me to create